Imagine standing at the edge of the world with nothing but a 10-pound note and a backpack full of broken dreams. At 19, most people are choosing universities or starting their first real jobs, but Ava Carter was choosing between a park bench and a rusted shed on a forgotten patch of mountain soil. Everyone told her to walk away, that the land was cursed and the structure was a death trap. They laughed when she handed over her last bit of cash for a pile of scrap metal and rot. But what lay beneath those rusted sheets of tin wasn't just junk. It was a secret that had been buried for 50 years, waiting for someone desperate enough to dig. If you think you know how a story of homelessness ends, prepare yourself. Because what Ava built from the ashes of that $10 hut didn't just give her a roof over her head. It sent a shockwave through the entire valley that no one saw coming. The cold wind whipped through the thin fabric of Ava Carter's hoodie as she stood before the heavy iron gates of the Foster Care Transition Center. In her right hand, she clutched a brown envelope containing her birth certificate and a legal document stating she was now an independent adult. In her left hand, she held the straps of a backpack that contained her entire life, 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, a worn-out copy of a classic novel, and exactly $42 in crumpled notes. The system was done with her. At 19, she was no longer a ward of the state, she was just another face in the crowd, one with no safety net and no home to return to. Ava had spent the last decade moving from one temporary house to another, never staying long enough to hang a picture on a wall or call a place her own. She was tired of being a guest in other people's lives. She wanted something that belonged to her, even if it was just a square meter of dirt. She spent her first 3 nights in a crowded shelter, the air thick with the smell of damp coats and unspoken misery. It was there, while scrolling through a discarded local newspaper, that she saw the notice. It was a tiny column at the back, listed under tax-delinquent properties. There was a plot of land high in the rugged mountains of the north, a place so remote and undesirable that the county was practically giving it away. The back taxes amounted to a mere $10. The description was bleak, an inaccessible lot with a derelict agricultural structure of no value. To anyone else, it was a liability. To Ava, it was a kingdom. She took a bus as far as her remaining money would allow and walked the final 12 miles uphill. The air grew thinner and the trees grew taller, their branches heavy with mist. When she finally reached the coordinates, her heart sank. The hut was worse than the description. It was a small, rectangular box made of corrugated iron that had rusted into a deep, bloody orange. The roof had partially collapsed under the weight of fallen pine needles, and the wooden door hung by a single, screeching hinge. It sat in a clearing where the grass had grown waist-high, reclaiming the path that once led to the entrance. To a surveyor, it was scrap metal. To the locals in the town 5 miles down the road, it was an eyesore they called the rusted grave. But as Ava stepped onto the sagging floorboards, she didn't see the holes in the ceiling or the mud on the floor. She saw a window that looked out over a valley of emerald green and a sky that stretched on forever. For the first time in 19 years, no one could tell her to leave. She sat down on the dusty floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and listened to the silence. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. The first week was a lesson in survival. Ava had no electricity, no running water, and only the food she could forage or carry in. She spent her days clearing the thick brush away from the walls, her hands blistering as she pulled at stubborn vines. She used stones to hammer the rusted sheets of metal back into some semblance of a wall, sealing the gaps with mud and moss. Every muscle in her body ached, and the hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. One afternoon, while she was scraping layers of grime from the interior walls, she noticed something strange. Beneath the filth and the cobwebs, the back wall of the hut wasn't made of metal like the others. It was solid stone, built directly into the side of the mountain. It looked out of place, far too sturdy for a temporary shelter. As she brushed away the dirt, her fingers caught on a small, recessed iron ring. It was a handle, hidden behind a flap of rotting wood. Her breath hitched. She pulled, but the ring didn't budge. She pulled harder, leaning her entire weight back, until with a groan of shifting rock, a small section of the stone wall swung inward. The air that rushed out of the hidden opening was stale and cool, smelling of iron and old parchment. Ava hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had no flashlight, so she waited until the afternoon sun hit the door at just the right angle to illuminate the small space. It wasn't a room, but a narrow alcove carved directly into the mountain rock. Inside sat a single wooden crate, remarkably well preserved due to the dry, cool air of the cave. Ava reached in, her hands trembling. She expected gold or jewels, the kind of things people found in stories, but what she pulled out was far more mysterious. The crate was filled with hundreds of small, hand-bound leather journals and a collection of glass jars filled with dried seeds. Each journal was meticulously dated, stretching back to the late 1950s. The handwriting was elegant, written by a man named Elias Thorne, who had apparently lived in this hut for 40 years in total solitude. As she flipped through the pages, Ava realized she hadn't just found a shed, she had found a life's work. Elias had been a botanist who turned his back on the world to study the rare flora of these specific mountains. He had spent decades crossbreeding mountain flowers and herbs to create variants that could survive the harshest winters and thrive in poor soil. He had documented the medicinal properties of plants that the rest of the world had forgotten. The jars of seeds were labeled with names she didn't recognize, accompanied by sketches of vibrant, shimmering blooms. But the journals also told a darker story. Elias had been chased off his land by a local development company that wanted to build a luxury resort on the peak. He had hidden his research, hoping to return, but the dates ended abruptly in 1998. Ava looked around her rusted sanctuary and felt a sudden, fierce sense of protection. This wasn't just a place to sleep anymore. It was a library of lost knowledge. However, her discovery was quickly overshadowed by a more immediate threat. The following morning, a sleek black SUV crawled up the rugged path, its tires churning through the mud Ava had spent days clearing. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, holding a clipboard and looking at the hut with pure disdain. He introduced himself as Marcus Vane, a representative of Vane Enterprises. He told Ava that there had been a mistake at the tax office. The land she had bought was part of a larger tract owned by his company, and her $10 deed was being contested. He offered her $500 to leave quietly and sign over the rights. Ava looked at the man, then back at the hidden stone wall. She knew $500 could buy her a few months in a cheap hostel, but it would also mean the destruction of Elias Thorne's legacy and the end of her only home. She refused. Marcus didn't raise his voice, he simply smiled, a cold, clinical expression that didn't reach his eyes. He told her she had 48 hours to vacate before the bulldozers arrived to clear the site for a new access road. The fear was overwhelming. Ava was 19, penniless, and legally outmatched. She spent the night reading Elias's journals by the light of a small fire. In the final entry, Elias wrote about a specific flower he had perfected, the silver alpine rose. He claimed it was the most resilient and beautiful flower in existence, capable of blooming even in the snow, and that its nectar possessed healing properties for skin ailments. He had planted a small garden of them in a hidden terraced patch behind the hut, protected by a natural rock overhang. Ava grabbed a rusted trowel and scrambled up the rocks in the moonlight. There, tucked away in a crevice she had missed, were dozens of glowing, silvery white flowers. They were breathtaking, their petals shimmering like moonlight. She realized that if she could prove these rare plants existed on this land, she might be able to claim environmental protection for the plot. But Marcus Vane wasn't going to wait for a botanical survey. He wanted her gone, and he was willing to play dirty. The confrontation happened sooner than Ava expected. Only 24 hours had passed when she heard the heavy rumble of machinery echoing through the valley. It wasn't just Marcus in his SUV this time, he had brought a crew and a small excavator. They hadn't waited for the legal grace period to end. Ava stood in the doorway of her rusted hut, her arms crossed, her heart thumping so hard she could feel it in her throat. Marcus stepped forward, his polished shoes now caked in the mud Ava had been struggling to manage. He told her the demolition order had been fast-tracked due to safety concerns regarding the structure. He claimed the hut was a public hazard and had to be brought down immediately. Ava knew it was a lie, a tactic to destroy the evidence of her residence and the rare plants before she could get anyone to listen. Just as the excavator operator started the engine, a second vehicle appeared on the horizon. It was an old, battered pickup truck that belonged to Silas, the local hardware store owner Ava had spoken to briefly when she first arrived in town. Silas was a man of few words, but he had a long memory. He had known Elias Thorne and had been one of the few people who didn't mock the old man. He hopped out of his truck, followed by a woman with a camera and a notebook. She was a reporter for the regional paper whom Silas had called after Ava had mentioned the stone wall during a visit to buy nails. The presence of the press caught Marcus off guard. His smooth, corporate persona began to crack. He tried to block the reporter's view, claiming the site was a construction zone and unsafe for visitors. But Ava didn't stay quiet. She stepped forward and shouted for everyone to hear that there was a hidden laboratory inside the mountain. She led the reporter and a very reluctant Marcus toward the hut. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Ava pulled the iron ring and revealed the hidden alcove. The sight of the hundreds of leather journals and the jars of seeds stopped everyone in their tracks. The reporter began snapping photos, her eyes wide as she realized the scale of the discovery. These weren't just old books, they were the lost records of a man who had become a local legend. Marcus tried to dismiss it as junk, but Silas stepped into the alcove and picked up a journal. He read a passage aloud, a description of the silver alpine rose and its location on the cliffs. The tension in the air was thick. The excavator operator, a local man who had grown up hearing stories of the mountain alchemist, turned off the engine. He refused to move another inch until he knew what he was digging up. Marcus was fuming. He threatened to sue Silas, the reporter, and Ava for trespassing and obstructing a legal business operation. He claimed the deed was his and that the plants were irrelevant. But Ava held her ground. She pulled out her $10 receipt and the county map she had spent hours studying. She pointed out that the boundary lines Marcus was claiming were based on a survey from the 1940s, whereas her tax deed was based on a more recent government assessment. She argued that the land wasn't part of his tract at all, but a small, forgotten wedge of crown land that the county had every right to sell. The reporter was recording everything. The homeless girl versus the corporate giant story was unfolding in real time. Marcus realized he was losing control of the narrative. He made one final, desperate move. He lunged for the crate of journals, intent on reclaiming what he called abandoned property on his land. But Ava was faster. She stepped between him and the history of the mountain, her eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been there a week ago. She wasn't just a girl in a rusted hut anymore. She was the guardian of a legacy. The days following the confrontation were a blur of activity and intense emotion. The story hit the front page of the regional news, and by the next morning, it had gone viral. The $10 Queen of the Mountain became the headline that captured the public's imagination. People were moved by the image of a 19-year-old girl defending a piece of history with nothing but her bare hands. However, the emotional toll on Ava was immense. The adrenaline that had carried her through the standoff faded, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. She spent hours sitting among the silver alpine roses, wondering if she was doing the right thing. She had gone from being invisible to being the center of a massive controversy. The development company didn't give up easily, they buried her in legal paperwork and sent private investigators to watch the hut. Ava felt like a prisoner in her own home, the very place that was supposed to be her sanctuary. The real emotional peak came when a knock sounded on the makeshift wooden door one rainy evening. It wasn't a lawyer or a reporter. It was an elderly woman named Clara, who had traveled 300 miles after seeing the news. Clara was Elias Thorne's daughter. She had lost contact with her father decades ago after a bitter argument about his obsession with the mountains. She had spent years wondering what had happened to him, only to see his face and his work on a news segment. Clara sat with Ava in the small, rusted hut, the sound of rain drumming on the tin roof. As Ava showed her the journals, Clara began to weep. She told Ava stories of her father, how he used to bring her dried flowers when she was a child, and how he believed that nature held the cure for every human sorrow. Seeing her father's life's work preserved by a stranger who had nothing herself broke something open in Clara. She hugged Ava, thanking her for protecting the only part of her father that was left. In that moment, Ava realized the true consequence of her journey. It wasn't about the land or the money Marcus Vane had offered her. It was about the fact that she had finally found a family, even if it was through the ghost of a man she had never met. Clara, who was a retired university professor, looked at the journals and the seeds and told Ava that they were worth a fortune to the scientific community. The silver alpine rose wasn't just a pretty flower, its properties could revolutionize natural skincare and medicine. But more importantly, Clara promised to help Ava fight the legal battle. With a legitimate heir to Elias Thorne's legacy standing beside her, Ava's claim to the land became ironclad. The development company, fearing a PR nightmare and a losing court case, finally withdrew their claim. They were forced to issue a public apology and pay for the restoration of the site as part of a settlement. Ava sat alone on the cliffside that evening, looking out at the valley. The realization hit her with the weight of a physical blow: she was safe. She wasn't going to be moved along by a social worker or a landlord. She owned the dirt beneath her feet and the air in her lungs. She thought about the millions of people who were one bad day away from where she had been. She thought about the rusted huts in everyone's lives, the parts of ourselves we think are worthless and broken, but which actually contain our greatest treasures. She had started this journey out of desperation, but she was ending it with a purpose. She wasn't just a girl who survived, she was a girl who had built something. As the sun set, turning the silver alpine roses into glowing embers of white light, Ava felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since she was a small child. The journey had been brutal, filled with cold nights and terrifying threats, but every blister and every tear had been the price of her freedom. A year later, the mountain peak looked very different, though its soul remained unchanged. The silver alpine rose was now being cultivated in a controlled environment, with the proceeds from its medicinal extracts funding a scholarship program for youth aging out of the foster care system. Ava wanted to make sure that no 19-year-old ever felt as lost as she had on that first day. The rusted grave was now known as the Hut of Hope. Visitors from all over the country came to see the place where a girl with $10 had changed the fate of a mountain. Ava lived in a small, modern cabin just a few hundred meters away from the original hut. It was simple, sustainable, and entirely hers. She spent her days working alongside botanists, learning the Latin names of the plants she once only knew by their colors. She had become an expert in her own right, her hands now calloused not from desperation, but from the careful work of nurturing life. She often thought back to that first night when she had shivered under a thin blanket, listening to the wind whistle through the rust. She realized that the hut hadn't been a stroke of luck, it had been a mirror. It was a broken thing that just needed someone to see its value. The closure of her story didn't come from the money or the fame. It came on a Tuesday afternoon when a young man, barely 18, climbed the path to the preserve. He had a backpack that looked far too heavy and eyes that looked far too tired. He told Ava he had heard her story and had walked from the city because he didn't know where else to go. Ava didn't give him a lecture or a handful of cash. She handed him a trowel and pointed to a patch of ground that needed clearing. She told him that the work was hard, and the nights were cold, but that the mountain didn't care about his past. She showed him that even the most rusted, forgotten things could be made beautiful again if you were willing to put in the time. As she watched him take his first hesitant steps toward a new life, Ava knew her journey had come full circle. The lesson Ava Carter learned was one she shared with everyone who visited the peak: your value is not determined by what you have, but by what you are willing to build with the scraps you are given. Resilience isn't just about surviving the storm, it's about finding the seeds that only bloom after the rain. Today, the silver alpine rose thrives on the mountain, a shimmering reminder that beauty can grow in the harshest conditions. Ava still keeps the original $10 tax receipt framed on the wall of the restored hut. It serves as a reminder of the day she decided that she was worth more than nothing. She had turned a rusted hut into a home, a secret into a legacy, and a lonely girl into a leader. The mountain was no longer a place to hide, it was a place to shine. Ava's story reminds us that the world often overlooks the very things, and people, that hold the most potential. We are taught to value the shiny, the new, and the expensive, but true transformation happens in the dirt and the rust. If you're feeling like you're standing in a broken place today, remember that Ava didn't find a palace, she found a ruin and had the courage to stay. Your current circumstances are not your final destination. Sometimes, the smallest investment of faith, even just $10 worth, can grow into a legacy that shocks the world. Keep building, keep digging, and never let anyone tell you that your rusted hut is worthless. You might just be standing on top of a miracle.